Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most gruesome serial killer cannibals, and even though he had multiple mental illnesses, he was found legally sane during his trial. You tell me how anyone is in their right mind if they eat 17 people? That's beyond me. But this is the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer. On May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Joyce and Lionel had a son named Jeffrey. Jeffrey didn't have the best parenting situation because his mother was a depressed alcoholic. And on the other hand, his dad was never really around because he was a full-time student in school working to get a degree so he could fully financially support the family. On one occasion, Jeffrey actually found his mother overdosed in an attempt to, end her life. He definitely was neglected as a child. It wasn't until later on in life that Jeffrey was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder. It's very important to understand that so you can understand how the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer works. And I don't know why I just put face primer on when I'm going to do my eyeshadow. If you're unfamiliar with borderline personality disorder, people who suffer with this have long-term, unstable interpersonal relationships. It causes a distorted sense of self. These people have strong emotional reactions that can lead to self-harm and the harming of other people. They constantly are struggling with the feeling of emptiness, unfulfillment, abandonment, and the detachment of reality. These people act upon feelings and not logic. And on top of all of that, he was dealing with schizotypal personality disorder, which is a mental behavior disorder and thought disorder. It falls under the schizophrenia spectrum. Some symptoms are social anxiety, paranoia, derealization, transcendent psychosis, and unconventional beliefs. He would have a hard time understanding what was real and what was not real, what was socially acceptable, what wasn't, what was laws and what weren't laws. He probably thought that everybody hated him, but that he was also a god and was capable of anything. Mental health is important. Please do not neglect it. It's just as important as breaking a leg or getting a cold. From an early age, Jeffrey was really interested in dead animals. It started when they found a dead animal in the crawl space under their house. According to Jeffrey's dad, for some reason, this really interested Jeffrey. He liked the sounds that the bones would make. He called them his fiddlesticks. It's kind of weird that you would let your child play with dead animal bones. So occasionally they started going out and looking for dead animals together. Jeffrey and his dad started collecting these animals. They kept them in these glass jars with formaldehyde and things that would preserve them. See, Jeffrey didn't really have any hobbies and nothing really interested him. His dad thought that Jeffrey's scientific curiosity was good for him. It gave him something to do, something to look forward to, which any parent wants their kid to be like happy and excited. So his dad would help him with his taxidermy hobby. When Jeffrey hit puberty, he discovered that he was actually gay, but being gay was not acceptable in his family. So he hid his sexuality from, well, everybody. And this is when he first began to start having these dark fantasies. When he was 16, he had this fantasy that he wanted to basically attack someone who was jogging along this road that he would drive on. He would attack them by hiding in the woods, and then when they came by, he would hit them with a baseball bat. He would knock them unconscious and then make sexual use of their body. So he actually tried to play this out. And the thing is, that one particular jogger never came by that day, so he couldn't go through with his plan. That was Jeffrey's first attempt at ever hurting anybody. You would think he'd be like, oh my God, what am I doing? That is so wrong. I should never do that. But the fantasies never went away. In 1978, Jeffrey was out driving his car and he came across a man named Stephen Hicks. He was hitchhiking and Jeffrey offered to give him a ride in his car. He said, if you come back to my house, I'll give you some beers, we'll hang out for a bit, and then I'll drive you wherever you need to go. And Stephen agreed. He got in the car, they went back to Jeffrey's house, they had a couple beers, and a couple hours go by. Stephen tells Jeffrey, like, hey, I got somewhere to be. If I don't hurry up, like, I'm gonna be late. Can you please take me there? And Jeffrey's like, no, just stay for one more beer. Stephen did not like this. He was like, all right, dude, well, I'm gonna leave. So he starts to leave the house. Jeffrey did not like this. So he grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell weight and he smashed it over Steven's head, which it knocked him out. And then Jeffrey began to strangle him with the barbell part of the dumbbell. Metal part you hold it at. For some odd reason, this like really turned Jeffrey on. So Jeffrey's like, you know what? This is like really hot. I think I'm going to jerk off. So he jerks off on him. Even though Jeffrey really enjoyed this a lot, it scared him because for the next 10 years, he didn't commit any crimes. I do believe at this time he was trying to clean up his act. Like he didn't want to be that person. So he enlisted into the army. In the army, he served as a combat medic. But while he was there, he had a drinking problem. He was deemed unsuitable for military services. So they discharged him. Clearly he was struggling with what happened, and I think he drank to try to, you know, numb the pain. So he gets back home. And less than 2 weeks later, he's arrested for disorderly conduct. He had to pay a $60 fine and he had to do 10 days time in jail. He was like screaming for help, but no one would help him. Jeffrey's dad was like really pissed off about this. So he sent Jeffrey to go live at his grandmother's house. Don't know what to do with the kid? Send him to grandma's house because grandma's clearly going to fix him. So he moves to his grandma's house and now he starts taking her to church every week. He's doing chores around the house. He's acting like a good boy. He even got a really good job working at a blood plasma center, but 10 months after working there, he got laid off. So he went back to drinking. He was out at the state fair, drunk, and he decided it would be a good idea to just fling his ding-a-ling out. It's not a cute look. So he was arrested again, and this time he's got to pay a $50 fine. It takes Jeffrey 2 years till he finds a new job, which out of all places, it's at a freaking chocolate factory. This is Jeffrey's like first real time to like explore the gay community. So he starts going to bars and clubs and bathhouses. In doing so, he ends up meeting multiple different men and he hooks up with some of them. When he hooks up with these guys, he's like getting really frustrated because he doesn't want them to move. This is when Jeffrey starts viewing people more as objects for pleasure than human beings. One day Jeffrey goes to the doctor and he's complaining about how he's having sleeping problems, and his doctor prescribes him with a very heavy sleeping sedative. He starts using this medication to drug these guys that he's hooking up with, giving them alcohol laced with the sleeping pills he got prescribed from his doctor. Look, like I'm not liking this look whatsoever, but I'm just gonna roll with it because life is short. He would wait until these guys fell asleep, then he would do whatever he wanted to their body. He would leave them drugged, unconscious. He was doing these at bathhouses, and when the bathhouse would find these guys unconscious, they would have to like call the ambulance and get them rushed to the hospital because literally they were like basically ODing. After pulling that same stunt 12 times at that same bathhouse, they banned him from ever going back there. But that didn't stop him. He just started going to hotels instead. And eventually drugging people was not satisfying enough for him anymore. He wanted complete control over his victims. So he comes up with this plan that he wants to steal a fresh corpse from a cemetery. He went to the funeral of an 18-year-old boy that he had seen in the newspaper and he thought this guy was hot. So he goes to the funeral, and after everyone leaves, he attempts to dig up the coffin from the ground. He gets his shovel out, he starts digging, but the ground is just like way too hard, so he can't steal the body. So he ditches that idea. On November 20th, 1987, Jeffrey books a room at the Ambassador Hotel. He goes to one of the gay bars to find a victim. He meets a guy named Steve, and I don't know how to pronounce Steve's last name, so I'm not even gonna say it. They get to talking, and Jeffrey asks him if he wants to go back to his hotel with him. And Steve agrees, and they go back to the hotel together. He gets there, Jeffrey offers him a drink, he agrees to the drink. Jeffrey gives him alcohol and he slips some sleeping pills in there. For some reason, something happened that night and Jeffrey just like doesn't quite remember, because when he wakes up in the morning, he finds himself laying on top of Steven, and Steven's chest is crushed in. He has bruises all over him. There's blood coming out the corners of his mouth, and he's lifeless. Jeffrey's hands and forearms were bruised, and he has no recollection of ever killing Steven. He panics and he leaves the hotel to buy a large suitcase. He comes back, He puts Steven inside the suitcase, and then he takes a cab back home. And at this time, Jeffrey is still living with his grandma. So he takes the body of Steven back to his grandma's house. He brings it down into the basement, and that's where he hides it for a while. He keeps Steven's head and he uses it as like a stimulus to get him off. And if you think that's bad, things get much worse. This whole experience inspired him, and he starts making this like a regular thing. He starts luring guys to his house, telling them like, I'm a professional photographer. I will take pictures of you and I will give you money. If someone was to pay you just so they could take pictures of you, like that's a pretty easy job. So a lot of guys like agree to this, and they go back to his house, his grandma's house, thinking that they're gonna get paid to take pictures. Jeffrey offers them a drink, slips some sleeping pills in it, they fall asleep, and he strangles them. And on one occasion, his grandma wakes up in the middle of the night to find him with a guy that he has drugged. And she has to like convince Jeffrey to take him to the hospital because he's like not looking so good. She ends up asking Jeffrey to move out of her house because his drinking problem is so bad, and because she's uncomfortable with the fact that he keeps bringing guys home to her house late at night. 2 days after he moves out of his grandma's house, he's arrested for drugging a minor. He pled guilty to the charges. 2 months after his conviction and 2 months before his sentencing, he commits another murder. This man's name was Anthony Spears. He had done the same thing over and over, that now he had this routine. But for some reason, Anthony was different for Jeffrey. He preserved Anthony's head and his in acetone, and then he stored them in this sacred black box of his, which on occasion he would take to work with him, leave it in his locker. I don't know, man. I guess he just wanted to like keep this guy with him. So he ends up spending a year in jail because he's found guilty with what he ended up doing with that minor. And when he got out of jail, he moves to 924 North 25th Street into apartment 213. After only living there for 1 week, he killed his 6th victim. His name was Raymond Smith. He used the same technique he always did. And the next day after he committed that crime, he bought a Polaroid camera. He would set the bodies of his victims up in multiple weird positions and then like take pictures of them like that. 3 months later, he goes looking for another victim. He meets a man named Ernest Miller. He told this guy, I'll give you money if you let me listen to your heart and your stomach. Ernest agrees, and he goes back to Jeffrey's apartment. Jeffrey only had 2 sleeping pills left, so he drugs this guy, but it's not strong enough, so he slashes his carotid artery. Then Jeffrey poses him in various strange positions and takes Polaroid pictures of him like that. He cuts him up, and then he wraps up pieces of his heart, liver, leg, bicep, and he puts them in his freezer so he can eat them later, which he did end up eating them. 3 weeks later, he ends up murdering another man, David Thomas. And for 5 months, he didn't kill anybody after that because he couldn't find any victims. Men were going missing in that area because of him, so people were cautious of where they went and who they went with. Jeffrey wanted to induce someone into a zombie-like state so that he could have full control over them. He constantly had pieces of body parts in his apartment, and it started to get extremely stinky in there. Multiple people from the apartment complex started complaining about the smell coming from his apartment. Jeffrey would be like, oh, my freezer's broken. I just have a bunch of meat that's like not been frozen. It's like going bad. This disgusting odor like lingered, and it never went away. This is where Jeffrey should have gotten caught. Jeffrey lures his youngest victim back to his apartment. It was a 14-year-old boy. I don't know how to say his last name, but I'm just gonna call him Ken. You remember when Jeffrey was arrested for taking pictures of a minor? Well, this was actually the younger brother of that same boy. What are the odds? Ken knew this. Jeffrey offered him money for pictures, and Ken was very hesitant at first, but because he wanted the money, he ended up going back to Jeffrey's apartment with him. Jeffrey drugged him, then he drags him into his bedroom where the body of Tony Hughes is laying on the floor, lifeless. Ken was still like conscious, but like barely there because he was so drugged. He saw the body of Tony, but he literally couldn't do anything. Jeffrey drills a narrow hole into his frontal lobe, and then he injects it with hydrochloric acid. Jeffrey leaves him there in his apartment like that, and then he goes and buys alcohol. This young boy who is drugged manages to get up and out of the apartment to the front of the apartment. He can barely walk, he can barely speak, he has no idea of who he is or what's going on until he stumbles upon 3 women, and these women call the cops. That's when Jeffrey comes back to his apartment and he finds Ken sitting outside on the curb with those 3 girls. Jeffrey tries to convince the girls that that was his boyfriend, and when he gets really drunk, he acts like that. But they don't believe Jeffrey because this little boy is naked and he's bleeding. They wait there until the police show up, and Jeffrey explains the same thing to the police, that that's his boyfriend and that's how he acts when he gets drunk. But they believe him, so they send Kim back home with Jeffrey. The police went as far as to go inside of the apartment and make sure Ken gets home safe. The police take a quick look inside, and remember, there is a dead body in Jeffrey's bedroom, but the police don't go into the bedroom. They tell him, you know, have a good night, stay safe, and the police leave. And later on that day, Jeffrey ends up killing Ken. He should have gotten caught right then and there, but he doesn't, and he goes on to kill 4 more people. And this is where it all comes to an end for Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey goes out looking for his next victim, and he meets Tracy Edwards. He offers Tracy money in exchange for photographs. So they go back to Jeffrey's apartment. They're engaging in small talk, and then Jeffrey gives him his drink with the sleeping pills in it. Tracy doesn't drink it though. He's not thirsty. He doesn't really like alcohol. So they're sitting on the couch talking, and Jeffrey's like, look over at my fish tank at my tropical fish. Tracy looks over there, and when he does, Jeffrey hooks a handcuff onto his hand, and he pulls a knife on him at the same time, and he says, if you don't do what I say, I'm gonna kill you. So Tracy listens to everything this guy says. Jeffrey guides him back into his bedroom with the knife, and in the corner of his bedroom, there is this massive blue barrel vat. That smell, that's where it's coming from. The Exorcist movie is playing on like a VCR TV, and they both sit down on the bed. They're watching it together. Jeffrey tells Tracy to lay down on his stomach, but Tracy doesn't listen to him. So Jeffrey lays down on Tracy's like chest, because like Tracy's like laying on his side, and he starts listening to his heart. He looks up at Tracy and he tells him, I'm gonna eat your heart. And this whole thing goes on for like an hour, 2 hours. Tracy's like trying to convince him, like, hey man, I'm your friend, like I'm never gonna let anything happen to you. Yet these guys had just met like that night. So Tracy's saying anything that he can to get Jeffrey to like befriend him and let him go. As Jeffrey's watching this Exorcist movie, he starts going in and out of like this chanting mantra, like he's like saying like slurs that don't even make sense. Eventually, when Tracy gets the right timing, when Jeffrey's like looking away for a second, Tracy like hits him so hard, and Jeffrey like stumbles back and knocks him basically out, but he like tries to get up and get him. Tracy runs out the door. He gets away. He escapes. He's running down the street and he runs into 2 police officers. He tells them there's this crazy guy, he tried to kill me. So the police go back to Jeffrey's house with Tracy. And that's when they find the Polaroid pictures that he took, and they arrest him. In total, Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 young men. He was found guilty, and he was given 16 life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. In total, that's 941 years in prison. If Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't caught, he wouldn't have ever stopped. And at the age of 34, while he was in prison, he was bludgeoned to death by an inmate. And that is the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Here is today's finished makeup look. It's not my favorite, but it's actually like not that bad. I like the crystals. Tell me what you think. Let me know in the comment section below what you thought about this video, and if there's any other true crime stories you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comment section. I love you so much. Thank you for coming back to this video. I'm Mackenzie Marie, and you can follow me on any of my social medias at Mackenzie Marie, and I will see you here in my next video. Toodles!